we're hearing so much about automation, artificial intelligence. You would think naturally you might look, well, it's going to be a shrinking workforce, but in your research, you actually found that a lot of this stuff, rather than totally replacing it, is going to augment a lot of it. Or where it will replace, it replaces with another position altogether. So there's been a lot of buzz there's been a lot of buzz in the media with ChatGPT. You've probably heard. And it's a pretty powerful large language model. And just as an example, I went on the system and I asked it, give me the procedures for recovering a small passenger vehicle out of a ditch and loading it onto a flat deck. And that was basically the prompt that I gave it. And it was pretty amazing what it came back with. It was a very detailed list of things that operator has to do in order to safely recover that vehicle. Now, I could have got even more specific with that. I could have given it even deeper prompts, that it was a high traffic zone, et cetera, the type of vehicle, and I'm sure it would have come back with even more detail. Hello everyone, welcome EV friends, and welcome to our very first live stream podcast of the EV Friendly. Today we have a very exciting topic, which we're going to be discussing electric autonomous vehicles and their impact on the aftermarket services industry. And joining me to discuss this topic today is Susan Mowbray. Susan is the Chief Economist of MNP, and she leads the Economics and Research Practice. Susan, welcome to the EV Friendly Live podcast.
Great. Thank you, Ken. It's wonderful to be here on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon.
It is. It is beautiful down here at the EV Friendly studio as well. So let's begin here with a few of these background questions. Tell me about who MMP is and what was the purpose for conducting this research?
Yeah, so MNP is a professional services firm, so we provide a full range of services to our clients, from everything from accounting and tax right through to consulting. And the group that I lead, the Economics and Research Practice, our whole body of work is just around doing custom research to inform decision making. And so that was really what this project was about. It was a piece of custom research to really try to understand how a lot of the trends around technology are going to be affecting the workforce in the aftermarket automotive sector. So most people, I think, are quite familiar with the idea of electrification. We've heard a lot about that in terms of meeting our zero emission vehicle goals here in British Columbia. But there's also things like autonomous driving systems and robotics and all sorts of different automation that are having a really big impact on the industry as well. And so that was what the research was about, was to look at how these different technologies are going to affect the requirements for the workforce going forward. And so we looked at things like, if you have more autonomous driving systems on your vehicles, what does that mean for crash rates? And by following on from that, what does that mean for collision repair? And so those are some of the kind of questions that we looked at for this. It was a bit of blue sky, and as you know, where there isn't really a roadmap for what happens when you do a significant change like this to something like the automotive sector. So yeah.
So what exactly, can you talk a little bit sort of the overall scope of the research, some of the things you looked at, and what industry subsectors does it cover?
So I guess the first thing we did was look at with the changes, what are the categories of technology that we were going to look at? So electrification is certainly one of the movement towards zero emission vehicles. That was the big one. We also looked at, as I said, as autonomous driving systems. We looked at AI, we looked at virtual reality, we also looked at robotics. And so those are really the areas that the research was looking at, and how would those be used either on vehicles or by people who were servicing these vehicles. And so when we talk about the aftermarket automotive sector, what we're really talking about is after you purchase the vehicle, what happens to it? all the things that go into it. So over the full life cycle. So you're looking at mechanical repair, you're looking at towing, you're looking at collision repair, glass repair, looking at the aftermarket parts. So if you're buying accessories for it, as well as, if you have a resale, so used car dealers, and then finally at the end of life, auto recyclers. We also did include new car dealers in this because we wanted to really get a sense across the full workforce. There's a lot of overlap with the workforce that's in the aftermarket automotive sector, as well as with the new car dealers, and a lot of the changes that are happening are going to have the same effect on new car dealers as they are on other parts of the automotive sector. So those are the sectors that we looked at, and when we started to look at the sectors, we wanted to understand how different occupations get impacted by these things, and so we looked at 4 groups of occupations. When we divide those down, we start with sort of the sales and admin processes. So that would be the people that are selling you your car or selling you your parts, or in those customer service roles. Then we also have management occupations. So there's some sort of management behind the scenes, whether that's a shop owner in some of the smaller shops, or in a big operation, you may have an operations manager, a service manager who's operating different departments and responsible for overseeing that. And then we also, of course, looked at the technical side. So that would be your technician. So this would be, when we think about it, it's the skilled trade occupations. So things like your automotive service technicians, your auto body and collision repair technicians, your auto glass technicians. And then we also looked at drivers and other technical things that aren't necessarily where you have a red seal ticket, but which are just, do require a certain set of knowledge and a certain set of skills for it. So it was really looking at those 4 occupational groups, how those different types of technologies would be affecting what was going to happen in it. And it was quite interesting to see as we started to look at things, because the real question is, if we haven't, how do we determine what's going to happen? And so usually what you would do is you look to history, and you're looking for circumstances in other industries or in the automotive sector in the past where there was a significant change in the technology and what happened to the workforce. And so there was a bit of historical research, and as well as a lot of, I guess, as I said, blue sky. And it's like, well, what do you think is going to happen there? Yeah.
Right. We've gone through some periods with this. Yep. Obviously, some computerization that started happening in around the 80s. We went into fuel injection systems, which replaced older carburetors. And we've seen these alternative fuel things before, particularly in the 90s, as you recall. Remember, it was the propane and natural gas and the biodiesels, and they kind of went a little bit by the wayside and stuff. This is a little different, though, and I think the impact is going to be far more reaching, because it affects all the industry subsectors, just not just one, and every employee classification. So already the automotive industry is coming under some attrition. We're having troubles finding workers, training them. Overall, how big of an industry are we talking about? Do we have any idea in terms of the size and the scope of the industry?
Yeah, so as part of the work that we did look at sort of how many businesses there are in British Columbia and how many people those businesses employ. And so right now there's somewhere between 3,800 and 3,900 businesses in the sector. The largest subsector of that is mechanical repair, so small mechanical repair shops. And in total, there's about 40,000 people that are employed in the aftermarket automotive sector in BC. And if you look at what's happening huge with the transition, it's a lot. And we're seeing attrition, as you say, because as the workforce has aged, we're seeing people exit. But going forward, we're not expecting the requirements or the required workforce to shrink all that much. It's still expected to be somewhere between 40 and 43,000 people over the next 20 years that are going to be required to support our vehicles on the road. So
it seems a little counterintuitive because we're hearing so much about automation, artificial intelligence, you would think naturally you might look, well, it's going to be a shrinking workforce, but in your research you actually found that a lot of this stuff, rather than totally replacing it, is going to augment a lot of it, or where it will replace, it replaces with another position altogether. So there's been a lot of buzz there's been a lot of buzz in the media with ChatGPT. You probably heard, and it's a pretty powerful large language model. And just as an example, I went on the system and I asked it, give me the procedures for recovering a small passenger vehicle out of a ditch and loading it onto a flat deck. And that was basically the prompt that I gave it. And it was pretty amazing what it came back with. It was a very detailed list of things that operator has to do in order to safely recover that vehicle. Now, I could have got even more specific with that. I could have given it even deeper prompts, that it was a high traffic zone, et cetera, the type of vehicle, and I'm sure it would have come back with even more detailed. But of course, ChatGPT doesn't have arms or legs, so can't actually do the work. But would you see something like that then as an extension or augmenting, rather than actually just replacing that tow operator?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that's kind of what, if we look historically, so we did look at historically in other industries, we know that when there is significant technological change, it doesn't necessarily leave, put people out of work. What it does is it changes how people work, and it's what we call labor augmenting. And so going forward, what we know is that, with electric vehicles and zero-emission vehicles, they tend to have fewer moving parts. So there's probably going to be fewer mechanical repairs required, but they have more computer programming, like computer systems on them. And so you're going to need technical support to keep the software updated. So the job changes. And so when we did our forecast, what we're looking at is how many by occupation, and there's certain occupations where you're not going to see a lot of growth. Like, we don't expect there's going to be a lot of growth in automotive service technicians, the number that are required, because, as I said, there's fewer moving parts on vehicles, and as we go forward, there'll be less repairs per vehicle. So as the number of vehicles on the road grows, you don't need to add as many automotive service technicians, but there's still going to be a lot of people required to service the existing fleet. And then when you look at things like, if you look at repairs, that example with ChatGPT is a great example of how something like the AI can help you identify how, you can just ask it, how do I fix this? Where's the latest information? It can compile the steps for you that you can walk through to do it. So it will aid in research. Maybe you're a tow truck driver and you're on the, in your example, and you suddenly come across a vehicle you've never had to load before. You can quickly check, how do I do this? Or something, just to tap into that base of knowledge. So that's how we'd see a lot of these technologies being used. In terms of robotics, there's certainly options for robotics to be implemented in the sector. One of the things when we're talking about things like robotics, though, it's a significant investment, and so there's the question becomes what size of business is going to be able to, does it make sense, and how much volume do you need to sort of invest in having robotics to do your maybe to do your change your tires, or do your wheel alignments, etc. So that's not necessarily something the small shop on the corner is going to be interested in investing, because the volumes just might not be there. So it's a rather complex question.
Right. So it's going to be a while before we get serviced by a Tesla bot in this industry. What are we looking at in terms of what are we looking at in terms of the timeline for when the whole fleet sort of shifts to electric autonomy, and how far did the research go?
So what we were looking at, we looked at from 2023 to 2040, and the reason that we were looking at that was really that sort of corresponds to when the target for all new vehicle sales in BC moving to be zero emission. And it's important to recognize that by 2035, 100% of passenger vehicles in BC that are being sold, like new passenger vehicles, will need to be zero emission. But even though that's the case, you're still going to have older vehicles on the road. And so when you think about the transition, it's not that there's going to be 100% electric vehicles in the next 10 years. It's just the number that are being sold. So you're going to see a situation where you have a mix of vehicles on the road for a while. And the forecast that we did based on meeting targets, that if BC is able to meet all of its targets, is you're still looking at like 60% of by 2035, 2040, only 60% of the vehicles on the road are going to be zero emission. The rest are still going to be internal combustion engine. And some of those zero emission vehicles will also be plug-in hybrids. So they will have those internal combustion engines as well. So that means we're going to need a mix of different types of skills. So if you're training today, or you've just become an automotive service technician and you're familiar with working with internal combustion engines, that skill is going to continue to be in demand going forward. It's just that we're not going to need to, we're just going to need to change our training as we move forward with these things. Similarly with collision repair, we know that the automated driver assistance is sort of reduces some crashes, and it was interesting talking, because part of this research we spent a lot of time talking to industry just to understand what they're actually experiencing as we go through this adoption. And the general consensus is that the ADAS technology, it reduces those like low impact collisions, but you get more severe collisions that require more significant repairs. So similarly, collision repair, they may be doing fewer repairs, but they're taking longer.
Right. So let's touch on the training, because I think what you're seeing is rather than every business becoming a hybrid model, you can actually see a divergence of business and skills developing, can't we? Especially, look, if you're 40 and older, you might think, look, gas cars are going to be around for quite a while. I don't really need to invest in much of this. I'm just going to specialize in repairing or servicing those vehicles. Or certainly if you're younger, you're going to really have to embrace that technology, and you may start to specialize in that area, in electric autonomy. Do you want to comment about that, and how will that affect our traditional training models moving forward, and how we go about in our continuous learning?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest impacts on the training is going to be just that we need to move away from this, you get your red seal and you're done, for a lot of the red seal, like the skilled trades. And even, with you need to move to, as you said, the continuous training model, where you're upgrading your skills, and you're going to need to learn a little bit about each new technology. And that training is going to be required not just for your skilled trades, but it's going to be required for just about everyone that's working with these vehicles in any form, from the people selling them to the people that are recycling them, so that because it is, there are certain things that are different about these, and parts aren't necessarily as interchangeable as they would have been previously, like 20 years ago, because of all the computerization. And so there's going to be specialization. We expect there to be some specialization, where some people, like some shops, will just focus entirely on internal combustion engines. Others may focus entirely on electric vehicles, or certain classes of electric vehicles going forward, just because the amount of knowledge that you need to be able to maintain, it's a significant investment. That's probably going to lead to like some consolidation in the industry in places like more densely populated areas. We'd expect to see shops get bigger, just to be able to cover that.
Why is that? So why is that exactly? So are we just going to start seeing fewer smaller shops, or they're just going to start merging into bigger ones, so to speak? And why is that?
Yeah, and this comes down to the economies of scale that are, and the technology, like the investments in technology that are being required. So, for instance, to gain access to repair information for a lot of vehicles, it's offered through a subscription service. And those subscription services vary a lot in price. We, through our research, we heard that some manufacturers charge $1,000 a year for a subscription service that gives you access to the repair information, whereas others it's 30,000 plus to get access to that. So, these kind of things add layer upon layer of cost for small businesses, which makes it hard for them to do that. The other thing is training. Having to invest in training, and this ongoing training adds on a cost. So having some way to either consolidate or work together to get that training and deliver that training is going to be essential going forward. So as I say, in places like Vancouver, we'd expect to see some consolidation. In smaller communities, that's you may
Right.
have just one shop going forward.
Right. And this is another way that we'll probably see an impact of technology is on the training. Because it is going to place a financial burden on some of these smaller shops, especially if they're located out on the outskirts. It's going to be very difficult to send an employee or release them for several days to come down to the Lower Mainland for an in-person class. We're going to have to get creative in this industry in how we deliver the training. And technology can play a role in that. Do you want to comment a little bit about virtual reality, augmented reality, or even just the online?
Yeah,
how can this play a role?
Yeah, there's certainly a couple different ways to deliver training that are being tried. I know that during COVID, we all got to experience the virtual world and having to do everything over a Teams call or a Zoom call. And so some training can be delivered that way. But then virtual reality and augmented reality can give you the opportunity to, try and replace parts or work with different places, with parts without actually working on the vehicle. And we're starting to see some use of those tools for training in certain areas. I know some of the big manufacturers are using that to provide training to their technicians with virtual reality and augmented reality on it. In smaller areas, technology presents a really interesting opportunity for providing training. As you say, don't necessarily want to, for small businesses, it's hard to release your staff to spend 3 days and pay for costs to spend 3 days in the Lower Mainland to do technical training. But through technology, it's possible that maybe you could deliver some of that technical training remotely, or you could maybe look at having regional pods where they come together, like where there's a college or something that has that, and hosting that and letting people go to that regionally as opposed to having to come down to the Lower Mainland for that, which could reduce costs. And then through those pods, you could have, to use technology to bring in some of the specialist training that's happening.
Right. So we're going to have to get creative. But one thing,
Yes.
I read through the report, it does emphasize investing in training is going to have to be a priority. And we're going to need help from that, not just from industry, but also from government is going to have to play a role in this as well. So in terms of jobs, what jobs are there any jobs you predict are just going to go the way of the dodo in the next 10 years? Or are they going to change? And then what new jobs, what new positions are we going to actually see creative out of this?
Yeah, I think it's not so much that positions are going to, I think you're going to see some, certain positions at some of the larger facilities sort of start to consolidate and disappear, particularly around admin or reception type positions. Those might get consolidated. What we would expect to see is more technological skills being required and more digital skills. So you're starting to see programmers, like people who can come in and reprogram vehicles and load the software updates that are working alongside automotive technicians or collision repair technicians. So I think you're definitely going to you're going to see those types of positions, and we're already seeing some shops employing those kind of positions, people who are really comfortable with technology and can do all the programming of it. We're also expecting to see an increase in the need for people to really understand data and use data and interpreting data and analytics. so that they can figure out what needs to be done and what this means. So those are some of the big ones that stand out. I think over time you'll start to see things like scheduling and dispatch possibly get automated. So it's possible that you won't, if you're a towing company, you might not need as many dispatchers. There'll be some technology that'll allow you to sort of do that. You'll have to manage your fleets with telematics and that.
Right.
So if you're charging your fleets, keeping all those kind of things.
Right.
So I think those are the kind of positions that are most likely to be affected. There's also some on the sales side. You may end up having end-to-end, depending on what happens to. So when you go in to buy a car now, you see the salesperson and they pass you off to the finance people and so on. That could become just one person does the whole sales transaction going forward with the help of technology.
And increasingly online as well.
Yeah, so if you start to see more manufacturers move to the same sort of delivery model as Tesla, where the dealership just becomes a delivery, where you take delivery of the car as opposed to where you go to purchase the car. Maybe you've already pre-ordered the car and the dealer's responsibility is now just delivery of the car and sort of getting you oriented with the car and things like that. That changes the mix of skills that your salespeople need and, the number of salespeople you need.
Right. Now, the report focused more on the labor front, but it did document the changing business models that I think industry is also going to have to be aware of. Some of the direct-to-consumer models, such as Tesla, but the whole there's the ride share. There's certainly vehicle ownership in the future can be a lot of questionable, whether we're just going to be owning fewer people owning fewer vehicles. Do you want to comment on that aspect of it as well?
Yeah, I think some of the things about the way that people move is changing. Mobility is changing, especially in urban areas, and so I think that there's an expectation that over time there's going to be a divide. So in heavily populated urban areas, you'll see more car share, you'll see more alternative forms of transportation, so that could lead to reduced vehicle ownership. And once you have car share, it changes how you deliver service. So now you're servicing a fleet as opposed to individual vehicles for individual consumers. So that's one thing that will happen. Whereas in sort of rural areas, we don't see a big change in ownership models. There's just not the density to support a car share model in most parts of BC, with the exception of the Lower Mainland and possibly the southern Vancouver Island. So there's that piece that's definitely going to change how people move. We also know that we've also seen a decline in ownership among younger consumers. So, and this is mostly in urban areas where there are other types of transportation available. So whether you have public transit, whether it's easy to bike, and those kind of things reduces car ownership. I know my own kids have no interest in owning a car. It's hard enough to even get them to get a driver's license. And we heard of that a lot from different people as we were talking. And there is especially in urban areas, there is less ownership of cars expected as we see people, for younger generations going forward.
Absolutely. It should be noted as well that even though we are seeing these projections of 100% sales by 2035, assuming all sort of that goes according to plan, but it won't be distributed evenly as well. So you're going to see much higher concentrations in the urban centers like Vancouver, Victoria. Whereas you get into the more rural areas, that mix is going to be, over the next 10, even 15 years, is still going to be more of a preponderance of gas and diesel that's being used, or a hydrogen-based or something like that.
Absolutely.
We don't quite know yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of things that are really sort of barriers to adoption, other than the fact that there isn't enough vehicles to meet demand at this point. One of those things is the availability of people to service them in rural areas. That's something that's certainly a barrier to adoption, as well as infrastructure. So those things, if people in outside of the Lower Mainland are going to be driving electric vehicles, you need to have people that are able to service them outside of the Lower Mainland, as well as the infrastructure to charge them and maintain them.
Yeah, and that can't be stated enough. If the EV transformation is really going to catch on and grow, we really have to start thinking about more and more than we are about the aftermarket, about these rural areas, and just having that service infrastructure there, because it just won't happen overnight. So we're not alone here in BC, but I think BC has really come quite far out ahead. There was a part of the report that looked at other jurisdictions. What are other areas doing? Are they doing anything? Are they ahead of us, behind us? Where do we stand?
BC, so we looked at a couple different jurisdictions just to see what, as you said, what other jurisdictions were looking at. So we looked at Quebec, because Quebec is sort of within Canada. Quebec and BC tend to be leading in the electric vehicle space. BC is definitely ahead of Quebec. Quebec has started to think a little bit about that, but they haven't really wrapped their head, from our review, they haven't really wrapped their head around what this means for the automotive workforce yet. We didn't find anything in California or New Zealand. We do know that like Norway is the country in the world that does have the biggest fleet of electric vehicles on the road at this point. They've reached their targets of 100% sales, or close to 100% sales.
There was 80%.
And so they're
80%.
Sorry.
No.
Yeah, it's very close to there. And so what they've been seeing is that, first of all, they don't have any requirements for training for these, and that's sort of something that got flagged in some recent work. And also at a presentation, I was attending a presentation at the Canadian Auto Dealers Association, and there was someone from Norway that was speaking, and they said that they have stopped training and hiring people, at the car dealers, to work on internal combustion engines at this point. It's all focused, all their new training and all their new hiring is focused on being able to work with electric vehicles. So they've sort of reached almost that tipping point where we'd sort of expect BC to be sometime in about 15 years. So, but
Right.
Beyond actual training and looking at the whole thing, I think BC, it's safe to say BC is at the leading here.
Indeed, and yet so much more work to go. So one of the objectives of the report was not only to research, examine, and identify all these challenges and potential problems, but also to offer some recommendations for going forward. So what were some of the key recommendations now that the report has delved into that you can share?
Yeah, I think one of the key recommendations is really around making sure that that training and everyone understands that they're going to need to dedicate more time and resources to training going forward to be able to service these vehicles. And there really needs to be a need to establish some training standards across the province. And I want to just talk a little bit about skills,
Right.
like skilled trades. Versus what we're talking about. So
Okay.
the skilled trade certification that's coming into effect for automotive service technicians and collision repair technicians, that's the Red Seal certification. That's really should be considered a first step in getting training to work in the sector and on these vehicles. The next step is to keep that, keep your knowledge up to date, and get knowledge of different types of vehicles and different technologies as they emerge. So there's really a need to be training on an ongoing basis. It's almost like professional development. If you're an accountant, you're expected to do a certain number
Right.
of professional development hours each year. And so in the automotive sector, that a lot of the occupations should be looking at things like, what are the professional development requirements to make sure that I know what I need to be able to, provide service to my customers and to be able to work with these vehicles. So that's a big thing, is to get the sector prepared for that need to continually be training. There may also be new ways to deliver some of this training, as we talked a little bit about virtual reality and augmented reality. On it, and also to make sure that the training is consistent across different areas of the province. BCIT has an EV training program, that they're currently trying to roll out across the province so that it's consistent, the information people are getting consistently across the province. And then I think one of the things that's really important, and we talked a little bit about this, and especially for smaller shops, is that industry is going to have to get creative and look for how can they collaborate in providing training to the workforce. And whether, like I say, whether that's shops coming together and bringing someone in to provide the training locally, or whether there's other ways to do it through technology.
Right.
Or those pieces that are there.
That can be a major, right? That can be a major, that can be a major stumbling block, because it's one thing to build out the training. Mm-hmm. It's the other thing to develop a culture of learning and continual development and professional development. And to instill in not only the employees, but the employers as well, you have a need to stay up on this. And I don't know how you build that. I think things like this report help because they give you some insight into what the future is going to be. But I don't know if you have any insights into how
and I think,
forward, what we can do to instill that.
I think it's almost, we talk about training for people to work on vehicles, and we focus a lot of time and effort on training employees, but there's almost a need to train employers. And sort of educate employers and sort of where things are going to be and how to respond to these things. So I think that's kind of one thing to think about. Is there a way to get this information to employers who may not have thought about it yet, and start to think about what they're going to do and how they can do so. It's almost an education. Educating employers is I would say as important as providing education for your technicians and the rest of your staff, so that employers know that this is necessary. And that's why things like EVfriendly are so helpful, is there that source of information on some of these things. Yeah.
Well, that's why we had to emphasize this is a slow transition. It's not a revolution. It's not going to just happen overnight, but it is a transformation. And you will, if you're not on top of it and you're not aware of this, it's not just something that, oh, well, I can put that off for another 10 years or it's not going to happen. I mean, it's going to happen. And you're just going to eventually get to the point, if you don't act, if you don't do anything of this, you just find yourself in a point where I'm just now become obsolete. And especially if you're young. If you're young and you've got a lot of years left and invested in this industry, then you really need to take stock and heed of this, and hopefully tuning into podcasts like this and just staying up on the trends is a first important point. We do want to give some time for some questions if anyone has tuned in and asking any questions, but just on a final note, what would be, from everything that you've gathered from all the insight of the report, what would be your one message to industry at this point?
I think industry needs to be prepared. They need to start preparing now, because it's going to happen faster than they think. And it's not, I mean, we're about to hit, like, one of the big things that we need that's on the horizon is, what do we do with these electric vehicle batteries as they start to need no longer be used in this. And that's something that we don't have a solution for right now, but it's going to happen really soon. And I think for industry in general, this is here, it's now. It's not something that you can think about, oh, well, I can think about later. You need to start thinking about it now so that you're ready to be, for the transition, and you're not going to get left behind.
Absolutely, yeah, very, very good point. Batteries and that whole sector is going to be key to the sustainability, not only for industry, but also for the consumers and for the growth. Because without a sustainable aftermarket, I do believe that we'll just alienate a very large segment of the population. I think that's how it'll end up. So that's all very, very good points. We just really touched on some of the highlights of the whole report. It's an in-depth study. We hope to release it out to the public within the next few weeks. Look for it on the ARA website. You're going to have follow-up discussions on this. So there's so much more to talk about it. Susan, thank you very much for appearing on the podcast. This has been a great discussion and the start of many.
Great. My pleasure, Ken. It was nice to chat with you today.